Good evening and welcome to Providence Road. We are glad that you're with us tonight. Those of you who are here live and those of you who are joining us online, thank you for being here for our ongoing conversation about mental health. Over the past several weeks, we have been talking about different topics, and tonight is a really difficult topic for some, and it's going to be on trauma, and we are glad that you've chosen to be here with us tonight. One of the things that we want to encourage you tonight is remember that in the last 15 minutes or so of our time together, there will be a number that will be flashing up on the screen at different times during our presentation for you to text questions. And we're going to have some time at the last 15 minutes of our session tonight to be able to take questions from the audience. Also, we want to recognize that when we talk about trauma, it is a very difficult subject, and there may be those that, as we talk about this subject, that you may feel some anxiety, you may feel some activation, you may even feel some triggering. And if you're here tonight live, we want to let you know that we have a staff and we have people here tonight who would love to sit with you and talk with you should you feel those emotions. And when you exit, if you just leave the auditorium and exit, someone will meet you in the foyer. Also, if you're watching us online tonight and you have some of those feelings as well, please feel free to text us your phone number to the same number that's up on the screen right now, 704-901-8898, and one of our staff will be in touch with you. So just remember that as we go through our time together tonight. We have been blessed each week to have a wonderful panel of clinicians, and tonight is no exception. And I'm going to ask our clinicians to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about them. And Nicole, we'll start with you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Good evening. I'm Nicole Six. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I currently work in managed care, but have spent my career really working in the trauma space. I've treated children and families extensively. I've been trained in a couple of different modalities, and I'm just really thrilled to be with you this evening to talk about such an important topic.
Thank you. Hannah?
Hi, my name is Hannah Booker. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate. Yes, that's pretty long. And I'm also receiving training to become a registered play therapist. Right now I work in Gastonia, and I work with children and teens. And I really started becoming interested in trauma when I first did my internship in graduate school, where I got to work with the Family Justice Center. Those are organizations, there are some local here, that serve individuals who are survivors of various types of abuse, and I worked with children and adults there.
My name is Morgan Lavender. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor as well. I have spent my career in community mental health and care management with a broad range of diagnoses and areas and field of work, but have spent quite a bit of time working with individuals who have experienced different levels of trauma.
One of the things we tried to do each week when we've begun our discussions about the various topics is to work on definitions. So Nicole, I'm going to ask you to start off with us tonight. Give us a definition of trauma.
I'd say probably my quick and easy definition would be probably an emotional or psychological response to a significant event. I'd say trauma can happen as a result of something happening to you, but it can also happen as a result to bearing witness to something that was incredibly overwhelming or really harmful. So trauma can have a lot of meanings depending upon the situation, but it really is that response, whether it's in the moment or whether it's at a later date, depending upon how your own body responds. That's what I'll go with right now.
Yeah, what I really like about that definition and what Morgan, you gave us on Sunday as well, is that it highlights the reaction and not so much what the situation or the trigger was. And this is important to remember because people experience things differently. So some people may have a lot of support and experience a really difficult situation and not have a trauma response to that. That's really important when we hear stories of other people, or you may have a friend or someone else at church who is trying to share something they've experienced, you may have experienced something similar and not had the same reaction. So being really loving and supporting in that, and not making assumptions or assuming that they may be, overreacting or something that could be difficult or invalidating for them. So it's really that body response.
The only other thing I would add to that is with the body response, and mentioned this on Sunday, is with trauma, it is very unique in that it does kick off a certain level of, different chemicals within the body and keeps them there. So it turns switches on that are difficult then to turn off at times. So unlike something where someone may be going through a depressive episode, situation resolves, depression kind of resolves. When individuals have experienced trauma, once some of those responses get turned on, it is very challenging to turn them off. And it is, it's the emotions, it's psychological, but there is a physical component to the body kind of storing and keeping the trauma that makes it harder to do so.
So, Hannah, when we talk about trauma, what are the different types of trauma that one may experience?
That's a big question, Kent. So when we talk about trauma, there are a lot of events that could potentially provoke trauma, and those are things that as counselors we screen for when we see new clients to help us understand their background, particularly if we know that they're coming in for a trauma response. But trauma can be caused by an acute event. So this would be some big event. This could be something like a car crash or like an intense medical emergency. We can also have chronic stressors that become traumatic, and something important to remember in this area is that this can also include discrimination, and this can also include historic trauma, which is a topic in and of itself, but important to mention that individuals who are discriminated against and have historically been discriminated against not only experience that for themselves, but individuals generationally get passed down aspects of that trauma. We can also have complex trauma. That's a combination of stressors that are ongoing and acute events, which can happen, unfortunately, even from early childhood, which is something that I've seen that can culminate in ongoing concerns with trauma that need to be addressed.
I'll jump in and add some traumas that are probably the things that are asked about first, especially with children, but certainly important with adults as well, would be different types of abuse. So sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. I think it's also important to remember traumatic grief and just the experience of grief. Sometimes, for whatever reason, in this culture, sometimes we neglect to think about grief in that way, but I think it certainly, at least in some of the work that I've done, has been really impactful. And I would say we often see those things, unfortunately, layered. So you heard Hannah talk about complex trauma and really looking at when, unfortunately, traumatic events or experiences are layered on top of one another. We could probably go on and mention a number of different ones too. I think it's also important to remember that you can also be in natural disasters, so like things that are completely outside of human control. That can be traumatic experiences too, which again, I think sometimes we think about the immediate response to someone having experienced that and forget that often what happens is someone will have that experience or be part of that, and then there are experiences of trauma that last well past or may even surface much later down the line. So I'm sure there's more to add there, Morgan.
The only other ones I think I would add is a lot of people recognize big forms of trauma. So when you hear about natural disasters or you hear about abuse, those are a lot that are pretty easy to come to mind. But there are a lot of traumas that are a lot more silent, especially in childhood as individuals are growing up. And so trauma can also sometimes be looked at as what someone didn't get and not just what happened to them. So neglect, abandonment, a loss of a parent at a young age, having individuals in a household who end up incarcerated. Things like that can also be very traumatic in a childhood for something being taken away from them or just not having in their life. Can also be other forms of trauma. And again, to reiterate, not everybody who goes through those events will have trauma. And so it is very unique to that person and the experiences that they went through. But that would be the only other thing I would add is it's not necessarily something that happened to you, but maybe something that didn't happen or wasn't around that can also kind of create trauma as well.
So oftentimes when people talk about trauma, we hear an acronym, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. What is, Morgan, post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Yeah, so really, and we've talked about this through a lot of the other weeks, so when it goes from an experience or an emotion to an actual diagnosable disorder is really when it happens for a period of time. So if someone has gone through something that is a traumatic experience, post-traumatic stress disorder would be diagnosed if the symptoms continue and are persistent over a period of time. So somebody who goes through a natural disaster and it's within a month, 6 weeks after a natural disaster, that's not going to be considered post-traumatic stress disorder because it's still new. It only kind of goes into a diagnosis when it's chronic and persistent, like we've talked about it before, and when it's impeding your life significantly. So that's really something to kind of keep in mind. But post-traumatic stress disorder is kind of the way to encapsulate that someone had a trauma event or bear witness to a traumatic event that is then subsequently causing significant problems and functioning in their life and being able to manage and work through, and it's just impeding kind of normal functioning.
So I guess we can go a little more into the details about what some of those symptoms may be. And I work all with children right now, so I'll give you a few things that can impact children that may be a little bit different from adults. One of those things is, in adults we may see things like dreams where they may be essentially like reliving the traumatic event or are very related to the traumatic event. This can be similar in children, particularly in younger children, though we may see that they may have distressing dreams or trouble sleeping, but not identifiable themes for young children. We also may see this in their play. So children will replay out distressing things that they have seen related to their trauma because that's what they've experienced, and part of play therapy is for them to be able to process those things through play. So they may naturally go toward playing out those themes. Another one I commonly see with children as they get a little bit older and are able to talk more about something that happened, particularly with abuse trauma, I see this often, is these kind of globalized negative thoughts. So these are thoughts that are very broad and very unhelpful to the child. So this may come across as something like a child may get even a gentle correction at school, and they can take that as, I'm a bad person, because they have kind of been taught this through traumatic experiences. This is how their body has kind of misinterpreted this and led to, we've talked a lot through the different discussions I think about unhelpful thought patterns that can come about. This is true for adults as well, where they can have unhelpful large thoughts, and guilt is another one that comes up very often, not just for someone who has experienced it directly, but when we think about trauma like abuse or maybe even natural disaster, a parent may feel guilt about, well, what if I did this or that? Maybe I could have stopped this, which is an important part of why we want to not just assess that individual, but parents or siblings, other people involved may also need support.
The only thing I wanted to echo to close us out would be to go back to something Morgan said, just because I think it's really important in a culture that likes to talk about diagnoses a lot, is that the piece about it impacting your life in areas, I like to call them life domains, if you will. So there really should be an impact to a part of your functioning. So whether that's within your family system, whether that's for a child at school, for an adult that's in the workplace. So there's such a significant impact in what you're experiencing that you're not able to function in your life the same way you were before. And I just think that's really important because trauma is complicated in that. I think sometimes there may be pieces of these symptoms that someone experiences as a result of going through something. And that doesn't mean they're not legitimate, but it may not be that they meet full criteria for an actual diagnosis because there's a number of other factors at play. And so I just think that the domains of functioning is just a really important thing to always keep in mind when you're talking about someone in your life and you're thinking that they may have had an experience or that something's not quite right. That's a big one.
And off of that too is just because you have trauma and you have symptoms that are impacting you does not mean that it's any less if you don't have a diagnosis of PTSD, right? That is one type of diagnosis. It's one type of trauma, but we've talked a lot that, right, the diagnosis is not the identity of a person either. So a person can have trauma and need to work through that trauma and never have a diagnosis of PTSD. They don't have to be the same. So just to kind of share that information as well.
Hannah, you did a great job of telling us about some of the manifestations of that in children. But Morgan, what are some of the manifestations that teenagers and adults may have?
Yeah, so when you have things, the flashbacks, reliving, feeling like you're reliving that event over and over. You do have a lot of sleep-related issues, usually with trauma. Anger, we talked about this during the anger week. Usually underneath anger there is a lot, but usually people who have trauma can experience a lot of anger, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. Oftentimes because people don't really know how to put words to it. If it's not a big, right, trauma has been talked about a lot from big events, but if it's not a big event, oftentimes people don't necessarily recognize something as trauma. And so, anger, substance use is also masked a lot with trauma. That's a very common one. But a lot of it is with people who have trauma. You also have people who have stomach issues because you have related anxiety. So you've got some of that, right? Your nerves are kicked up. The way that your body is trying to react to things. So we talk about, you're in fight, flight, or freeze. But another kind of common is your body is overreacting to future situations. So if something may have made you mad, someone who's gone through trauma, they may react a little bit more than what someone thinks is called for in that situation. So if someone is mean to me, before a trauma response, I may be able to brush it off, but afterwards, I can't let that go, and I'm going to respond. And so it's more of an over reaction almost that your body has, or it's a freezing that you don't know what to do and you almost become paralyzed and not knowing how to process or work through a situation would be some other kind of signs. But often, if it's right after a trauma, oftentimes you're going to see things like difficulty concentrating, flashbacks, sleep problems, physical symptoms, upset stomachs, headaches, and things like that as well afterwards.
I was just going to add that you probably saw a lot of similarities in the two answers, and I think the reality is that symptoms of trauma in adults and children, even though at totally different, sort of spaces in life, they mirror one another. They just look different because of the developmental age of sort of who's experiencing that too. So I think one thing that maybe manifests itself a little bit more specifically in children than adults too is a high level of behavioral problems. We can sometimes see, unfortunately, that children who may have had a traumatic event or a traumatic experience and are experiencing trauma can be mislabeled as having behavioral issues, particularly in the school system where that's what they're seeing, what we call external. So what they're seeing, the behaviors that are external to the child. And that can be a relatively common thing to see in trauma. They actually updated the diagnostic criteria several years back to include just that for that reason. But that's something to mention about children. There is a piece that we haven't really spoken about, and that's some dissociation. So there is some dissociation that can occur with trauma. I think, again, maybe contrary to popular media, it actually is quite uncommon, but it does happen. And you do this work long enough and you will encounter it. That's one of those things that you kind of have to tease apart a bit and ensure that it's related to that traumatic event, but is sort of this almost like the child or adult is apart from themselves is probably the best way I could explain that. And that might be in thought, that might be in action. But that's something else that I know we haven't mentioned today, but can occur with trauma and can be very real. And that's a really hard part too, if that is occurring for someone. That plus the other symptoms can be really, really tough.
So Nicole, is it possible for someone to develop symptoms even years after a traumatic event?
I wish I could tell you no. An answer I'd maybe like to say better, but yes, I think certainly so. I think, there's so many reasons for that. I like to say that all of our bodies are so different, right? And all of our life experiences are so different. And there's so many different factors at play as to whether or not someone can develop symptoms related to trauma. There's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle there, but yeah, I think sometimes things happen to us that we may not actually even recall on our own, so we may not even know they've happened. We may have those experiences come up because something triggers that in us. We may get involved as adults in therapy later in life and start to recognize that there are some things happening that we didn't necessarily know were happening. There may be even things because we can be... right? I think, again, sort of the American way, but like we're going to figure it out on our own and we're just going to deal with it. So I think sometimes people even may actually have some traumatic symptoms and don't necessarily realize that's what it is, which I think can happen too. So unfortunately the answer is yes. And it can have happened for a lot of reasons. I'll say that too. I also think that there's... what we like to call protective factors around people as well as risk factors. So your environment and the people that you surround yourself with and kind of what's going on in your life can impact how susceptible you might be to experiencing trauma too. We like to think of protective factors as things that are really stacked up in your corner is what I like to say, right? So you might have a really healthy home life, might have a really positive relationship, you have enough to eat, you have everything that you need. Those types of things are called protective factors, and risk factors would be the opposite of some of those things, right? You might have some significant basic needs issues. Maybe you've had some major turmoil in your family system. Maybe there's some other mental health or substance use issues in your home. So those are just some things that can make an experience different, depending upon some of those other factors.
I think our brains do a really good job at trying to protect us as well. So you have someone who's experienced some stuff, your brain will do everything it can to protect you so that you can keep moving on and functioning. And while they do a really good job at protecting, part of the way that they do that is by not letting you remember some things. And so there may be periods of time where you don't recall that event happened or that it impacted you as much as it did. And then something happens or something triggers it or something... some situation occurs and you start remembering parts of it. And so, I think however we are created and we are made, our body is trying to help us in the ways that it can. And there are a lot of people who do not start really experiencing some of the trauma symptoms or going through trauma treatment until they've gotten to a place that they feel safe, and then their body can relax a little bit. And when their body relaxes, a lot of things come out. And so oftentimes that could be years later. It could be, it's just completely individual based on that person. And I think Nicole, the way she described it, like all of us are so unique in that. And the way that our body holds our trauma is all very different. And because of that, I do think there is a lot that some people experience it immediately and some people kind of block it out. And then later on will kind of uncover, but it usually does come out.
And we've mentioned how part of trauma reaction can be anxiety, right? It's part of our body's way of protecting us, keeping us from getting in similar situations. So with anxiety, temporarily avoidance can be very quote unquote helpful. It can help us avoid having to face that. So I've certainly seen with clients who can successfully avoid things that may remind them of the trauma temporarily, and then for one reason or another in their lives, they have to return to maybe an area or people in their lives that brings that back up. So it can also be a resurgence of symptoms if they've been kind of avoiding confronting those things.
We have talked about, okay, here are things to say and things not to say. So, Hannah, how does one speak to a child or a teen about traumatic events that have occurred?
So this can kind of go in two different categories. There can be trauma that's happened to the child that they're experiencing, and also community or family events. And my general rule when I'm talking to parents and families is to be honest and age appropriate. So it's going to vary pretty drastically by the age of the child. So it's helpful to understand, or maybe to get some help from someone else in understanding that developmental age or even developmental level of the child, what they can understand, but to be honest with them about what's going on. This does not need to include a lot of detail, particularly with young children, but if this is a situation that's impacting their life, there needs to be honesty. Now, when it's with a child who they themselves have experienced something, this is where we're going to get into some more education and detail for the child. One thing that in particular can be really difficult for this is in the case of sexual abuse for children. People are understandably very hesitant to talk about this topic with young children, and when a child has experienced that, they've unfortunately been learning a lot of bad ideas, incorrect things that they have been taught through that abuse. So that's where we need to provide a really open and safe environment for them to ask questions that they probably have. They probably have a lot of confusion around what happened, and to provide corrective information for them.
Morgan, a minute ago, you referenced that there may be some things that come out later around trauma, some other issues. What are some of those other issues for those that may develop later, for those who have had a traumatic experience?
So there's a lot of research out there, especially recently, about kind of unpacking the trauma impact within the body and how the body keeps a score, which is a great book. It's very clinical, though, very tough to get through. But it is a great book, and what it does is it walks through, and there have been a lot of studies lately out there, but there are a lot of physical manifestations of how our body can actually hold on and store. And so you can look up any of this. But there are ways that if someone has untreated trauma, there are a lot of medical symptoms that are related to people who have experienced trauma. So there's a lot of research out there that chronic pain has a very high correlation with people who have trauma, fibromyalgia, any of your inflammation-based disorders. So there's a lot of skin-related disorders that are related to trauma. Arthritis has a high correlation of relating to trauma. Again, not causation, correlation. But there's also a lot of, you have somebody who has a lot of trauma. If they have an anger response, you're going to see things that you see commonly with high blood pressure, problems with liver, problems with heart disease and things like that. But there's just a lot of connection. There's also a lot of connection with the gut and irritable bowel syndrome related to trauma. But when you look at the why, part of the reason why is that, when someone has experienced trauma, especially a longer term trauma, and it's been untreated, you have a nervous system that is on alert. And anytime you have a nervous system that's on alert, it causes other things to be constantly on alert. And so your nervous system is tied in heavily to inflammation. Your nervous system is tied in heavily to your digestive system. And so anytime you have someone who's on alert within a trauma experience, they likely end up having similar medical related issues that are tied into the nervous system as well. So those are some of the longer term kind of untreated trauma. There's lots out there, and no one has them all, and you may not have any of them and still have untreated trauma. But those are some that there's been a lot of research lately in terms of long-term untreated trauma and how it impacts physically as your body is still storing that response.
The other thing I'll add, just for a little bit of a spin off of that, would be thinking about things that we experience so let me back up for a second. Thinking about things like involvement in the criminal justice system, or individuals who engage in domestic violence, trauma has this way of weaving itself all over the place. And one of the things that we learn as clinicians, because we see folks from all walks of life with all different types of experiences at all different spaces and time, that, there is, people will sometimes do horrible things. And one of the things that we've learned over time is to ask what happened to you that got us here, and that certainly doesn't negate personal responsibility. And I'm not talking about causation here, just to echo Morgan, but I do think it's important to also mention that behind some really tragically awful things that we see or hear about, and that tends to be what is displayed on the media, there are often some pretty significant trauma histories, and often some very unhealthy ways of managing trauma symptoms and things that folks were dealing with, and unfortunately not having sometimes adults in the lives of children to recognize those things, that things can go really awry. So I just wanted to mention that, just to sideswipe the question just a smidge, but just to mention that that there's relation there, and that sometimes that's harder because folks have done really awful things, but that it can be important to really remember those things too, and how important it is to address things early and to do our best to make sure that we're paying attention, I think, to symptoms and to things that maybe could be looked at in a different light, because there can be a real impact, particularly for folks who, as I mentioned earlier, don't have that stacked up corner full of protective factors that are already at risk for various reasons.
So, Nicole, are there any warning signs that may indicate a need for professional help when someone is processing or dealing with trauma?
I think I'd go back first to thinking about if you know someone, and even if you don't know someone well, but you're around someone a lot, you can see when there are shifts in the way that someone might be behaving, and you can see that there are shifts in the way that someone might be performing. So maybe you don't know what their symptoms are, because most of those they're keeping internal, but that's why when we think about the way that someone interacts with the world being so important, is that those are often things that we notice. So we might notice that someone has really shifted in a work environment. We also might notice that people are not showing up for things, that they were someone who was on time or somebody who was present, and now they're not showing up and they're not around for things. Or we might have someone who is expressing symptoms but is associating it to something else. Really haven't been sleeping well, I've been, or they're incredibly irritable. So I think there are some of those initial warning signs that are really just in the way that person interacts with the world and they interact with you, that can be things that sort of flip a switch in us. And we may certainly notice things, people who are very, very close to us, we may notice things much more intimately, and it can sometimes be a little bit harder to notice if they're not as close to us. But sometimes it's also a matter of just even picking up on the small things and even just asking. I think it's really amazing, and I know that we've probably all had this experience as therapists, is I think we live in a culture that's afraid to ask people hard things. People don't like to be uncomfortable. Certainly not saying that I enjoy being uncomfortable myself. But I think sometimes if we're honest with ourselves, we do notice when people are off, or we notice when something's not right, and we don't ask. And I would say, even to push that a step further, when we answer the question when someone asks us, how often do we tell the truth? Right? How often do we tell people we're fine when we're not? So one of the things that I think is also really important is sort of living out some of that in the way that we interact. And so it creates a space for someone else to do that. You know, so if I'm having a really hard day and someone asks me how my day is going, I'm a lot more inclined now, after having done this work as long as I have, to say, I'm having a really hard day. It's just really not been a great day. You know, I felt like I haven't really been myself. I've had a couple of interactions and they didn't go well today. I'm kind of in a funk. You know, just really being honest, because I think when you create a safe space for someone else to say what's going on in their life, I think it's amazing how people get comfortable sharing that. I think that can make a huge difference, and it seems so small and insignificant, but I don't think it is.
And to add, you probably noticed that echoes a lot of what we've said in most of the weeks about creating a vulnerability and a way in an environment that people can be vulnerable, because it's no different with trauma than it is with any other mental health issue someone's facing, right? Having that space, having people that they feel like can support them. Sure, there are a lot of appropriate times to get professional help with trauma. And again, if it's an extreme, if it's functioning life domains, probably an indication. But if they don't have that vulnerable ability to be in a safe space with someone and do that, they're likely not going to ever show those things, right? They're not going to present those things out publicly. I like the word Nicole used, performing, right? We perform for other people. But a lot of times, if someone really does, you know, especially for children, I would encourage a lot sooner work with children who have experienced a traumatic event. For adults, it's a little tougher because we've had years of performing and keeping it inward. But again, those ability to pick up on, you know, sudden shifts in behaviors and be able to kind of support someone. But I do want to emphasize with kids, though, if you know that a child has experienced a traumatic event or has a sudden shift in behaviors, that is an area that I would highly encourage sooner rather than later. The earlier kids get treatment for trauma, and the earlier kids have a safe network around them to work through trauma, the more resilient and ability they'll have to be a healthy, functioning adult and not carry years of trauma onward with them. And so, you know, I just kind of want to highlight that for the kid aspect especially.
Yeah, and going off of that, there are certainly signs we can see in children. My personal professional opinion is if you know particularly that a child has experienced something like abuse or witnessing violence, at least, you know, maybe go chat with someone. There are some things that we may see, right, like as behaviors that may actually be linked to the trauma. Another sign for children can be regressive behaviors. So you have a child that is beyond the age of tantrums and suddenly saying no to something, or something seemingly small is causing them to look like they're a small child falling out on the floor. That's something that we can certainly see with early childhood trauma. But getting that help, because at least things like abuse or witnessing things at the very minimal, they can get some assistance in getting that corrective information and also have a safe place to begin processing that.
Morgan, you used an interesting word, resilience. What is resilience?
This is Nicole's favorite topic. So, you know, resilience is the ability to move on, the ability to work through, not move on and forget, but to really work through, to be able to kind of continue onward no matter kind of what has happened. It's not letting something stop you in its place, but it's, hey, how can I work through this? So, you know, you hear a lot, like, kids are so resilient. well, kids are really resilient, and kids can bounce back from things oftentimes a lot quicker than adults. But it's that ability to, hey, this happened, and I may be stuck now, but I'm going to work through this. And here's how I'm going to work through this, and here's what I need to do to work through this. And there's a lot of ways to build resilience, so I'm going to pause there.
Thanks, friend. Morgan's right. I do love talking about resilience. She caught me. I will tell you something that I always think of when I think about resilience as a clinician. One of the first things you learn when you're becoming a clinician is that people can feel when you believe that their life can be different, or you believe that something is going to change for them. And part of that experience, I think is an honor as a clinician too, but to be in that space with someone, to know that things are going to get better. And the cool thing about the fact that we are so resilient is because most of the time things do. So people do heal, things get better, life changes, people do the hard work, and it matters because they start to experience less symptoms, things start to change in their life. But it does take work. I think sometimes resilience can get, that term can get sort of thrown around, right? And I don't want to discredit the work that folks do, whether it's a child or an adult or an adolescent, that they're doing that work. They're creating that space to build that in themselves. And people do, they make beautiful progress, and things change for them when you put in that work. And whether you've needed professional support, whether you've gone to therapy and you've engaged in that process and really built those skills in yourself. Children too. Children are amazing. Some of them could teach up here on the stage with us, as we all know. But you sort of build that and you create that. And I just think that that's one of the most incredible part about people and about the body in general, is the way it can heal. And what we're talking about, right? So it's easier to see when a broken arm is healed. It's a lot harder in the space that we're in to see healing in the same way. But when you do, and you start to see that someone is getting to that place, it's a really powerful thing. And you also watch the impact that has on other people too, the impact that those individuals can have on other people. But you need a support system too. That's an important part of resiliency as well, is that support is huge.
So how is it maintained? You talk about building it and talk about the support system, but what's the role of the support system in the maintenance of resilience?
I think it's safety in large part, truthfully. It's learning the skills that we've talked about up here, some today, but it's also being in a safe environment around people that are helping you continue to heal. Because in some ways, healing is a lifelong process. And I think maybe we've probably all had experiences to know that, to believe that. But then recognizing, to your question, is how do you maintain that, is making sure that you continue to be in that safe environment, continue to surround yourself with people that are encouraging you and that are part of your healing. Also being open and honest with people about what you need, how they can support you. How do you build your support system? By explaining to other people how to support you. And then truthfully, the other piece would be also recognizing when you're not okay. You can be in treatment, you can be doing really well, and you can have things happen that set you back. And it's building those protective factors into your life that are going to help you keep propelling forward and not sort of get stuck in that place of setback. Because life can throw some things at you. And unfortunately, sometimes folks may even have additional traumatic events in their life following having had treatment for a trauma. And so building that around yourself and kind of propelling yourself forward. But I don't think I could stress support enough, and having the people in your life that you need to have, healthy people in your life that you need to have, who are part of your healing, I think can really make all the difference. And there's, to borrow Morgan's research term, there's years and years of research about, particularly with children, about having at least one person in their life who's a constant support and who can really be that child's anchor. And there's really nothing that can replace that. And that's the power of human connection too, that I think is just a really integral part of healing.
One thing I want to add to that is how can support systems help? And Nicole talked a lot about healthy people. So I think the part to also talk about is part of resiliency and part of staying in a healthy path is also identifying when and where you do not need to continue relationships and when and where you have to set healthy boundaries. And so how support systems can help with that is helping enforce and protect someone's boundaries. So if someone has established a set of boundaries for themselves, whether it be against a person or against a certain topic or area, whatever it is that they need to set for their own life, support systems can help by helping that person enforce and recognizing that that is needed for that person. So part of healing may involve, forgiveness, but part of healing does not necessarily mean that you go back to connections and relationships. So I think that's really important, right? You have a support system and you want to be around healthy, but that does mean it's perfectly acceptable and okay to have appropriate boundaries in place for those areas that are toxic and not healthy to you or your healing. And having the people in your life who recognize and support those boundaries is essential.
And I'll just add a little bit onto as far as resilience. I think sometimes the kind of American way of things is, hoping to quickly get past this and move on, or, just tough it out through something. And when I think of resilience, it's more about the process of actually confronting what's going on and dealing with it. I think of this metaphor that I can't take credit for. Actually, one of my kiddos made it up while playing like a Jenga game. And it's that the blocks are kind of like emotions or pieces that we need to deal with. And if we're stacking them on top of the tower, or we're just kind of moving them around and ignoring them, eventually, like we all know, the tower's going to topple over. And that's one of the things we can see with trauma that hasn't been managed. It may show up in different ways in our bodies because it needs to be addressed one way or another. Our bodies know that it needs to be addressed. So when I think of resilience, I think of, rather than just moving those blocks around, doing the consistent work of, taking those pieces you need to accept of whatever has gone on, working toward accepting that, and what can you choose and what can you work through to make the future what you want it to be, and really cultivating hope in that way.
Well, we've had a few questions come in, so we're going to move into taking some questions from our audience. And thank you for those of you who have texted your questions in, and you can still do that at the number that's on the screen. So, Morgan, we'll start with you. How does a family deal with a family member who has acted in an abusive way that has traumatized a fellow family member, but they don't realize it?
So we don't control other people, so we cannot control whether or not someone will ever recognize the impact that they had. But what the family can do is supporting the person who's been through the event to have healthy boundaries and do what they need for healing. At some point in life, right, it kind of goes back to what Nicole said earlier, but oftentimes the question is what happened to you? So, right, there's a common saying out there that hurt people hurt people. So very true that a lot of times, a lot of what events happen are often related and have some seed of truth in something that may have happened to someone. But if a family member is, there is conflict within a family, I would say, because of some sort of a traumatic event, if that person's doing their own work, great. And if that person's not, it would be really focused on helping support the boundaries that a person who has been through trauma needs to put in place for themselves. And the family supporting that person and recognizing of how they can help support that person in setting the boundaries. because that, and until there has been a form of reconciliation, if there ever is going to be that, the support would be to help kind of keep that person who is working through their trauma in a healthy relationship, and that could mean boundary settings in place.
Thank you. The next question, and Hannah, we'll let you have this one. Is trauma limited to the occurrence of a single event, or could it develop over time by experiencing recurring, significant, but not major events?
Yes, absolutely. So as we've alluded to, we often think of trauma as these large, impactful events. But trauma can also build up over time. Things like I talked about earlier, discrimination, ongoing abuse, ongoing neglect, things that people need but that they're not getting. Even things maybe less commonly that we think of. When we think of discrimination, we often think of discrimination maybe about race or sex. But this can also be things like weight is often talked about, unfortunately, and discriminated against. Those seemingly very small comments that people may make over someone's lifetime, or situations that appear small, but those kind of things over time is what can train our brain to believe those unhealthy patterns, those unhealthy beliefs develop. And when we have these unhealthy beliefs that develop, like for example, a child developing this belief that I'm a bad child, then when they're hearing things, even maybe when they hear good things, they screen that through that belief that they have. And if it doesn't fit, they may not even be able to really fully accept that positive thing because it doesn't fit with what I believe about myself. So getting at that belief is really important. So certainly that's a huge aspect of trauma.
Nicole, what does therapy look like for someone addressing their trauma? Are there different approaches in therapy?
It's a big question, Kent. Therapy can look a lot of different ways. And so one of the, I think, wonderful things about therapy is encountering someone, getting to know their experience and kind of where they're at, and then really making a determination about what might be the most appropriate or healthy next step depending upon their presentation, maybe where they're at in their life right now, maybe their age, right? We take different types of approaches to dealing with trauma based on the developmental age of someone. There are a lot of different types of treatment, so I don't know that I'll sit up here and name all of them. I'll share that there's everything from specific ways we might manage or might treat trauma by treating very specifically the brain's response to trauma. There are ways we treat trauma by really diving deep into the actual traumatic event, really going back through that event, really identifying unhelpful cognitions, really looking at, if you've heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a number of different strategies in there that folks will turn to depending upon kind of someone's presentation and where they're at, but really looking at the intersection between cognitions and behaviors and feelings and how those things interplay. So a number of different strategies, very, very young children. Folks may use play, may use some other strategies for super young children. So there are so many modalities. That's what we call them in treatment, different types of modalities that we use to treat trauma. But it really is in that relationship with a clinician and that person kind of getting to know that person's experience, determining kind of what makes the most sense, and then really talking to that person about what that might look like and kind of gauging where they're at and what they're comfortable doing too. As clinicians, one of the things that's really important that we do is kind of recognizing in that safe space that someone is the expert on their own experience. It's something that we say a lot. I saw them nod. It's something that we say a lot in our field of practice because it's really important. And so even especially, I think it's with children and adults personally, that as we're making determinations about what might be the best course of treatment, that we really talk to that person, whether it's a child or adult or a family, about what that's going to look like. Because treatment for trauma also can start to bring up all different types of things. And folks, it's important that folks are prepared for that and that they're ready for what some of that might bring. So I'm sure my friends up here have things to add.
I do want to add a common misconception out there. There are a lot of people who have a belief that the only type of treatment for therapy is talk therapy. And there are a lot of types of trauma treatment that are not focused on talking. So a lot of people who have trauma say, I don't want to talk about it, or I don't want to talk about it again, and that's okay. So what Nicole was alluding to, like talking to the individual, you know, there are, right, Nicole mentioned a few, there's other acronyms out there, but there's EMDR as one that is much less focused on the exact talk therapy of the trauma, but very effective at treating trauma too. So it is very much up to the individual. People who may have one, you know, kind of one large event may be perfectly fine doing one type of trauma, and people who have complex trauma over years may want to do another one. And so there is, again, it goes back to what we talked about the first week, there is no one right or wrong type of therapy. It is a lot in that relationship. It's a lot in what that person will find effective. But I do want to make sure that anyone listening doesn't have that myth that trauma therapy means you have to talk about the trauma itself. There are a lot of therapies that are very effective that don't focus exclusively on that. And so I just want to make sure that people do know that, because I do think it's a common misconception out there for trauma treatment. But if someone does want to work through, you know, making sure that you are looking up that the person is trained in trauma, because trauma is different than depression, and trauma is different than anxiety, and they can have a lot of overlapping symptoms. But I would make sure that if you are looking to seek help and get help, that you are looking for people who are trained in trauma, and that is one of the areas. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that too.
So Hannah, how would one help a child whose behavior suggests that there is a problem, but they either cannot or will not identify the cause of their behavior?
Yeah, so this comes up very often where adults may be baffled at a child's behavior. This may be one of those warning signs that you need a little bit of extra help, because particularly with young children, I mean, even thinking about adults, if we're becoming really dysregulated in our emotions, we may not even realize why we're really, you know, irritable or snappy that day. So to try to ask a very young child or even an older child, you know, why did you act that way? They may not be able to tell you that. They may not be able to process what's going on and connect the dots, which is one of the reasons why we use play with young children. Play allows them to communicate in a way that they may not be able to developmentally do with their language yet. So that can be really helpful. So I would say seeking help from a professional and being able to tease out if that may be related to a trauma, and if it is, looking for appropriate treatment. And like Morgan said, it's perfectly fine to go to a clinician and ask about their treatment. We try to tell parents and individuals, give them an idea of what treatment will look like, and it's okay to, you know, ask what it will be like, or even if you've gone to a counselor a few times and that approach isn't working for you. Not every counselor is going to meet the need of every client. People have very different approaches, so being able to shift counselors or ask for, you know, look at different types of treatment that may match different people or different children.
Do you mind if I add something, Kent? I want to add that I think it's important with children too, because we've spent today talking about trauma, that children also have behavioral issues that are completely unrelated to trauma. And in fact, I would probably say that the majority, thank goodness, of behavioral issues that children experience across their life are unrelated to trauma. Because most children haven't experienced a traumatic event. Again, thank goodness. So, you know, I think that just wanted to make sure to mention that too, that there are all types of clinicians who have training in behavioral science too. There's really great behavior management work out there. I have a lot of experience in that space. It's what I did before coming into doing trauma work, and there's just some really good, awesome things that parents can glean from that work too. And so, again, I think that's great advice to seek out some support. Just being mindful that you may have a clinician tell you, like, we just have some good old-fashioned behavior work to do here, and you can take a huge, maybe, sigh of relief. Not that work's not hard too, but I felt like it was important to mention that and to draw that distinction, especially for kids.
Nicole, Hannah, and Morgan, thank you for your insights and your perspectives and sharing your professional learnings and experiences with us. This has certainly been a blessing. Each week when we wrap up our sessions, it's just a common theme among our audiences to talk about just the great job that our clinicians do. And we are so thankful and so grateful for you. And I hope that this has been a blessing for you. If you're watching us on Facebook, can we ask you to consider sharing this to your Facebook page? Because if you've been blessed by it, it also gives other people an opportunity to be blessed as well. Also, let me encourage you to please visit our website, www.prcoc.org, where you can listen to some of the sermons that accompany our series on mental health. Don't mention it. We've been tackling some really hard subjects, and want to encourage you to listen to some of our teachings on that. And also, you can, from that website, see the other clinician conversations that we've had on Wednesday nights. And we hope that you'll join us next Wednesday night. We will be welcoming Michael McFarland and Dr. Amanda McGow. I was looking for a slide. I thought we had a slide. Yes, here we go. Amanda McGow and Michael McFarland. We're going to be talking next week about suicide. So please join us and be praying for us as we prepare for those discussions. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are glad you're with us. Thank you.